Hello everybody, this is Scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. The slides are online at that bit.ly link, bit.ly/css-scope-ned. Like a guy named Ned. So I'm Brian Perry. I am a lead front-end developer at a company called Bounteous. I live out in the Chicago suburbs. But I'm from Cranston, Rhode Island, and this is the only context where that gives me some amount of street cred. Applause for Cranston, Rhode Island. First, that's a first. And I'm also a lover of all things component and component-driven, so building and theming with components in Drupal, design systems and tools like Pattern Lab and Storybook, and increasingly building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React. And also a lover of all things Nintendo. So if you want to talk about the cool games you're playing on your Nintendo Switch, I'm down. Currently playing Fire Emblem and Luigi's Mansion 3. Both are really awesome. Yes. Wow. I should stop now because that's a couple of points of applause. Yeah, and I'm also online in a bunch of places and would love to internet with you. And that's my wife and I at the Pats Bears game, which the Patriots won. It was amazing. So as I mentioned, I work for a company called Bounteous. We have offices throughout North America, but a couple in the Chicago area. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do, but we have a great team of Drupal folks who I learn from on a day-to-day basis. We're often hiring, so if you're looking to do great Drupal work, get in touch. If you need great Drupal work done, I'm sure we could also talk about that. So, CSS has global scope. Who here has used CSS? Excellent. So it allows you to write rules that small amount of code lets you create consistent styles across your site. It's great when you want rules to apply globally, and potentially not so great when you don't want that. I'm sure many of us have had some variation of this, where you've made you or somebody else on your project makes a change in your CSS, and there are unintended consequences somewhere deep in the reaches of your front end. And then a emerging trend is CSS in JavaScript, and many CSS in JavaScript solutions provide component scope. Who has used some type of variation on CSS in JavaScript? Okay, that's a good chunk of hands. Not 100% like CSS, but yeah, so they can provide component scope. And given that it's the internet, and many of us are developers, people tend to argue about these different approaches and which is right and which is wrong. But I think that there's advantages potentially to both, and that we should find a way to take advantage of both of them, or what both of them provide. And that's my talk, everybody. Thank you. How am I doing on time? Oh, I'm doing good. Okay. But I do see my stopwatch. I think I might have undershot it a little bit.
So
yes.
Do you like CSS?
I do.
We can save that for the end.
Okay. Yeah, undershot it a little bit. So maybe we can just go through it go through the slides again in more detail or something. All right. So this is scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. CSS has global scope. So let's talk a little bit about what that actually means. So this is just a really simple code pen that we'll take a quick look at. And mostly about inherited properties in this case. So one thing that CSS does is that many rules can be inherited by their parents. So we have an h1 and a paragraph tag here, and then this declaration block for the HTML element that sets a font family of Comic Sans, which is the one true font. And it results in the h1 and the paragraph both having Comic Sans. But if we didn't have that, or didn't have the ability to do it in CSS, we'd be in a situation like this, where we'd have to set that rule on paragraph, and then we'd only get our Comic Sans on the paragraph, and then we'd have to, for all of our elements, include them or repeat rules, and that certainly would not be great. The fact that these things can be inherited allows you to create nice, consistent styling with very little code, which is cool. And then there are a number of other things that go into how these rules are prioritized and assembled. So there's the concept of the cascade, the C in CSS. So there's a number of different origins that the style sheets can come from: author, user, or system. And those are all combined together and prioritized in a set of rules that very simple, very straightforward, and always easy to keep top of mind. Obviously being a little sarcastic there. The image is from a CSS Tricks post. A lot of informative information there, but it's presented like that, very overwhelming. So the simplest way to kind of understand the cascading order, I looked for articles for this. The best thing that I found actually was the spec itself. So briefly, so for all declarations that apply to a particular element for a certain media type, first they're sorted according to importance and origin. So things that are lower priority would be the user agent declaration, and then user normal, and then author normal declaration, so that the things that you, the developer, write in your style sheet, and then author important. So if you blast your important rule in there, that's going to win. And then user important declarations are even higher priority. And if that doesn't allow it to be decided, next is specificity, which we'll talk about in a second. And then if all else fails, it's just the order that they show up in the style sheet as far as what wins. So for specificity, found a fun article that uses Star Wars to explain specificity. So the kind of lowest priority, aside from the universal selector, which has no specificity, is an element selector, like HTML or H1. And then next in line is class selector or attribute or pseudo class. And then an ID selector has more specificity. And then the style attribute, so an inline style, is very specific. And then those can all be combined together in a number of ways. There's like a point system that you can provide. We're obviously not going to spend all of our time going deep into that. But yeah, the Death Star at the end with important just blows everything up. But I thought that was a kind of a cool way to explain specificity. So CSS in JavaScript can provide component scope and some other potential advantages. So some reasons why people might use CSS in JavaScript. We've already mentioned a couple times the concept of component scope. So that's the idea that for a particular component, the styles apply just to that and don't leak out elsewhere and don't influence other components. There's also the potential advantage of the styles being co-located with the components themselves. So it can provide potentially a positive developer experience. They might all be in a single file, or they're at least probably close to each other. And it's also potentially a good thing for components that are going to be distributed in some way, something that's like an NPM package, or even components that are kind of composed together. That can be an advantage. And then also because there's going to be either some JavaScript runtime or a bundler that handles this, there can be some dead code elimination. So the bundler, for example, can know what CSS will or will not be used and only package the stuff that is going to be used. I'm sure we've all run into some projects where there's been some additional CSS that's being loaded that isn't necessary, or 5 or 6 versions of Bootstrap or something like that. And then also, because things are scoped, it potentially takes some of the pressure off from a naming perspective. You won't have the situation where things that are named similarly can clash. And then also another advantage is that it's possible in some cases for these solutions to be aware of the properties that are passed into the component. So rather than doing something like toggling a class name for like an active state or something like that, it will just know that I have the active prop and I can change the styles dynamically. So you don't have to juggle things in the DOM in that case. And yes, admittedly, there are probably some cases where people take this approach. to avoid or try to keep CSS at bay because maybe they don't quite understand it. And why not CSS in JS, right? So if you are trying to avoid CSS with this approach, you are not going to be too happy because you still need to know CSS and how CSS works. It does potentially come with a bundle size or performance cost. So typically there's going to be some sort of JavaScript runtime that has to be bundled up with this as well. And then it could be a barrier of entry for developers who are experts with CSS but not experts with JavaScript. And kind of related to that, it's also potentially putting another layer or multiple layers of abstraction in between. So some of these approaches use more of a JavaScript object-like syntax, so less like traditional CSS syntax. There are some cases like that where there might be some syntax highlighting issues as a result of that. And also, potentially, because things are so specifically scoped, you can get into a situation where there's one-offs or inconsistency that are introduced as a result of that approach, as opposed to the global approach. So you might be wondering which approach is the right one, and probably not surprised to hear for our why don't we need to have both girl, that, again, I think that there are advantages to both approaches, and it would be great to be able to use both of them. So that is my talk. How am I doing on time? Still good. Still good? Still really undershot that. Boy, oh boy. Okay, well, I guess we can just maybe do it again and go a little bit deeper. So this is scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. CSS has global scope. Remember CSS? We talked about all the things that kind of give it superpowers, like the Cascade, specificity, and inheritance, which obviously is represented by 3 people fighting over a house. But also, some of those rules and how they combine together can be tricky and tough to wrap your head around. So we should probably get our act together and get organized. And there are a number of CSS methodologies that help with this. Some popular ones, object-oriented CSS, BEM, which stands for Block Element Modifier, and then there is SMACS, Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. I cannot believe I didn't trip over saying that. So they provide a handful of different things. Might be conventions for file organization, naming conventions, and also with some of the naming convention approaches, it'll give you something that feels like component scope. So a class name that's very specific to be used in this one particular context. And we'll talk a little bit more about BEM, which is a popular naming convention within the Drupal community, and something that I've used a decent amount. I found a cool Medium post that explains BEM from the perspective of an emoji. And I created a little code pen for it. So we'll take a look at that. Who has used the BEM naming convention before? Okay, a good number of people. So just quickly going over that, since a lot of people are familiar with it. So we have this div here that we gave a class for the block. So we gave it a class of face, which even by itself does have some meaning. It gave us that yellow circle. And now we'll create another div. And oops, we will give it an element. So blocks have elements inside of them. So it's like a sub-component. And in this case, we're going to create an element for the eye. So the naming convention for that is the block, and then 2 underscores, and then the name of the element. So face eyes. And we give face eyes, we have eyes in our emoji. And then we'll also do the same and give it a mouth. So face double underscore mouth. So now we have our emoji that has eyes and a mouth kind of in their neutral state. So the M in BEM is modifier. So you can also provide a modifier class with a particular naming convention to change these things. So let's say that we wanted our eyes to be open. We can add the additional class. We still need the face double underscore eyes, but we can do face, eyes, and then 2 hyphens for a modifier, and open. And then our emoji's eyes are open. We can do the same with the mouth. Whoops. And in the middle, get some really weird looking emojis. And we opened our mouth. And then there's a handful of other ways that these naming conventions and things like modifiers can be combined. For example, you can also have modifiers at the block level. So if we do face devil, we're going to get a red emoji. And sometimes you'll see these things nested and all that stuff. But that's the general structure of block element modifier. So I like BEM. A lot of people raised their hand, said that they use BEM. So it's a pretty popular approach for naming conventions and for front-end developers. It gives a really nice structure. It makes it really easy, at least from my perspective, to initially scaffold things. I don't really have to think too much about the general structure to get something in place. And it also gives you nice, specific component-focused classes, which in a lot of cases is going to make it less likely that things are going to conflict. But it isn't literally giving you component scope. There's still some cases where you could have some leakage. But it's not literally truly scoped to a component. And it's also not enforced at the tooling level or anything like some of the CSS and JavaScript solutions are. There are some things that can still help from a tooling perspective, like SASLint can actually enforce BEM naming conventions, which is nice. And it also requires discipline across your development team. Everybody's got to be on board with it. Everybody has to understand what BEM is and how the team is writing BEM. And people have to prevent themselves from cheating, because you could just cheat BEM if you want. And then also, the naming convention is nice and a helpful starting point. But I find you still do have to think about naming, and naming is always hard, and you will find, especially in cases where you have complicated components, maybe where things are nested, situations where you'll still struggle to come up with the right way to structure or name things. So CSS-IN-JS can provide component scope. So let's look more specifically at an example of that. So the first one that we'll look at is styled components, which is a React library. And we'll look at an example from this CSS-IN-JS playground site, which is really cool. If you haven't messed around with any of these CSS-IN-JS solutions, a great place to start. They have this example with a simple form, and then you can pick from a bunch of different libraries to see how they're structured. But we'll look at styled components here. I'll see maybe if I can make that a little bit bigger. And we're going to look at the form to start here. So we're importing styled from styled components, and then that allows us to, we'll look at this input here. You can define a constant. In this case, it's input with a capital I. And then that is a styled input. And then it might be a little hard to see on the screen there, but you can use a backtick, which is a tag template literal in JavaScript. And then inside of those backticks, you can write CSS, like you may be familiar with. And you can even do things like Sass-like nesting in here, which is nice. And that is going to give you, if we go down into our render method here, an input component, capital I input like we saw, that comes along with all that styling that we defined. And then if we actually inspect the input here, you'll see that the classes that are applied are kind of gobbledygook strings, right? And that's generated by the JavaScript runtime. And that's actually the way that the component scope happens. Because that class is only going to be applied for this particular component. And you can't use that class anywhere else unless you do something really crazy, which would be a very bad idea. So it results in those styles just being applied to this particular component. And then I also mentioned previously the whole idea that a number of these CSS and JS solutions can also be aware of the props that are passing to a component. So there's a really simple example of that here. For the submit button, based on the disabled prop, if it's true or not, it changes the color of the submit button. So the background color is one thing if it's disabled and one thing if it's not disabled. So I think I actually will have to zoom out a touch here. But so in this form, if I fill it out with the one true area code, so it validates, the submit button is blue now, as opposed to grayed out when it was not. And we don't have to change a class in the DOM or anything. The style just knows that under this particular context, I should be different, which is kind of cool. Okay, so that was styled components. Let's quickly take a look at another framework. So in Vue, Vue has a slightly different approach, and there's a handful of ways you can do this, but one that's very popular is the concept of a single file component. So I created a little code sandbox to illustrate that. Okay, so here we have basically just a few different H3s on the page. And if we take a look at our components, so in this hello world component, we just have a regular H3 that's being spit out. That's that first one, that traditional H3. And then I created a couple of other components. So there's this global heading component that still just takes a heading as an input and then spits it out in an H3. But in this file, we have the template defined, and then we have our JavaScript for the component, and then we also have style, our style defined. So we're saying that it's it's green. There's some padding, some margin, and a black border. And then if we look at our scoped heading, really similar component, but in the style section, there's different rules. It's navy, bigger font size, but there's the scoped attribute on the style. It's probably, unfortunately, kind of hard to see that. I don't know if highlighting's going to help there either. But yeah, it's just style scoped in that case. And that just indicates that the styles here should be scoped to that particular component. So you have control over that. You can decide whether or not you're going to have component scope or whether you're just going to use traditional globally scoped CSS. So if we just take out scoped here, what do we think is going to happen? It's global, and thanks to some of the specificity stuff we talked about before, this is the last style that's applied, so it takes over, and all of our H3s now have the big red border and the different size and color. But it's pretty cool that we in this case, have control over whether or not we're going to use component scope or global scope. At least I think it's cool. So, you probably know what slide is coming up next. Why can't we have both of these things? That would be wonderful. So that is my talk. It's definitely the end of my talk. And still short, though. So I guess we can, if everybody's down with it, we can go through one more time, dig into some additional detail. So this is scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. CSS has global scope. So we talked about a lot of things that give CSS some superpowers: Cascade, specificity, inheritance. We talked about BEM as a naming convention and a way to give ourselves something like component scope with traditional CSS. But based on what we've seen so far, some questions we might be asking is: could regular CSS have something like component scope for real? And the answer to that is not really. But this is kind of, I feel like a little bit of a tangent, but seemed like an interesting thing to talk about a little bit. There's also a trend with atomic or functional CSS that I've heard about increasingly lately. And is anybody familiar with atomic CSS? Couple hands, cool. So the idea here is that you instead use small single-purpose class names that usually have, they're named based on what they do. Should be pretty clear from reading them. And the CSS doesn't change, it's immutable. So really what you're happening here, and we'll see an example in a second, but you're actually really doing most of what you would do to change the look and feel of something actually in the markup rather than in CSS. You have a particular set of class names that you can work with. And there's a couple of different approaches. There's like the static approach where you get a particular set of utility classes, like a library or framework. Oftentimes it's configurable to some degree. And there's also the kind of crazy and intense approach of something that's programmatic. So actually in the markup that you define, that gets processed and then generates the CSS that you need for those rules, which is pretty wild. But the reason that I thought this was worth talking about a little bit, there's a library called TAILWInd that I've heard more and more people talking about and using. So this GIF from their homepage actually shows pretty well what it actually does. You have a bunch of these very specific classes that do things like even say that text is purple. And you add that in your markup, and you're not really doing much in the actual CSS. So this doesn't really give you component scope. It almost kind of sidesteps CSS altogether in a weird way. But it is interesting that some people really do not like this. I have seen others that have had good experiences working with Tailwind. But it is interesting that there is a desire for something like this as well. I think, again, it says something about some people's struggles with some of the global nature of CSS. For me personally, it is not for me. It really takes away a lot of the things that I do like about CSS. My general front-end development process. Maybe a couple of years from now, I'll have a different tune on this. But yeah, just looking at that GIF, it gives me like heart palpitations to think of doing things this way. Yes?
So is this your final markup, or is this compiled into something else?
In this case, this is your final markup, as I understand it. So Tailwind is a little bit closer to like a CSS framework, where they have a particular set of classes. You have some amount of configuration for things like your grid system and color system, but that's pretty much it. And you can pick and choose from these things. Yeah. But as we have mentioned a handful of times, CSS-IN-JS can provide component scope. But could it be more like regular CSS? So a lot of the examples we looked at was in a single file. We had some variation on styles written in our JavaScript. And that can go all the way from being very JavaScript object-like to something that feels a lot like CSS. There's also an approach, CSS modules. Who is familiar with or has used CSS modules? I think we had two hands on that one. So CSS modules, it's a little bit different from something like styled components in that it's not a package. It's something that's handled by your build process or your bundler, typically Webpack. It also scopes styles locally by default, but you have some control there. And it can play nicely with Sass, and because part of the bundler, it can play nicely with like Post CSS and all kinds of things. It also ships with Create React App and Gatsby, which was the context that I first started experimenting with it. And it has the fun, super snarky logo where something in CSS overflows its container. So we'll look at a quick example to kind of see how this works. So just a little static site about static sites, little side project that I created. So we'll just look at these card components. And so in this case, the actual styles probably don't matter a ton, but the general structure does. So this is a separate file, a Sass partial, project card.module.scss, and that .module in Gatsby, this is a Gatsby project, is how Gatsby picks up on the fact that it should use CSS modules. But so we have our general structure there. We've got our project card, parent level class. And then we have elements inside of it: title, language, description. So BEM-like structure, but not using a BEM naming convention specifically. You could if you wanted to, but again, you're going to get your component scope here. So then in our project card component, we're importing the project card.module.scss as styles. And then that is going to give us a styles object that we can use in our JSX below. So for the parent div, we say, for the class name prop, we say styles.projectCard, and then styles.language, styles.title, kind of as you would expect. And then similar to what we saw before, if we inspect the component when it's rendered, we're going to get those unique class names. I like the convention a little bit here in that it's a little bit more readable. We see the component, the class, and then our kind of unique string at the end. So again, that gives us component scope. It's not going to leak out. And it's nice that you're just writing your CSS in a Sass partial or a CSS file, just like you're used to. So here's our meme girl asking us, why don't we have both? And CSS modules, actually, she jumped in a little early, can handle that nicely. So you can still have global CSS here. So this is just the same approach, but just with a regular Sass partial. So project card.scss in this case. If we just import that, then the styles are going to be global and just part of our traditional global namespace here. And in the class name prop in our JSX, we can just pass in a string to just set the class name, and those styles will be applied. And they're also global, so you could use them elsewhere. So you can have a mix of both things, which, again, I think is quite nice. And it opens up some interesting possibilities. So this is related to kind of an ongoing decoupled Drupal project. But we have a portion of the site that's React, portion of the site that's Drupal. But we identified that there were global styles shared between both things. Really, at the end of the day, it's one site. But we wanted each of the different developer contexts to have their traditional experience. So we thought about how we could share those styles, even though we have different templating engines, and we're not literally going to be sharing components between React and Drupal in this case. There wasn't enough actual component overlap. So CSS modules opens up some interesting possibilities here because you just have, in this case, Sass partials, right? And each of the parts of the system can consume those as they see fit, or as your team sees fit. So on the React side, with CSS modules, we're importing our styles in JavaScript. Some of it globally scoped, some of it component scoped, and also have some CSS that's specific to React. And then on the Drupal side, we have a more traditional Sass build, a big Sass file that imports a bunch of different partials and outputs a single global CSS file. So same styles used in both contexts, but how the system sees fit, which I think is really cool. So we can have both. We can have our peanut butter in our chocolate. And all of this, and a common discussion point around CSS and JS is the concept of separation of concerns. And I know I was raised with a particular understanding of the separation of concerns that JavaScript and CSS and HTML should be separate. But the more that I build in components and think from a component perspective, the alternative approach here makes sense to me. The concept that the separation of concerns could be at the component level. You want to have your button that has all of the things necessary to render your button all in one place and easily distributable and repeatable and testable and all that stuff. And I think potentially both of these approaches are valid. But it's definitely just a different way of thinking of the separation of concerns. And another possible question is, could we have component scope with less JavaScript, right? A lot of the examples that we looked at had some sort of JavaScript runtime, had some sort of impact on our bundle size, or at the very least, had JavaScript. So, thinking about that, even outside of JavaScript, there's definitely a trend of popular extensions for a language becoming things that get incorporated officially, right? And CSS actually has some recent examples of that. Things that were popular in preprocessors have kind of been finding their way into CSS proper. CSS custom properties is an example of that, which does some things that like Sass variables do, but also has some other advantages. Nesting is something that's finding its way into regular CSS as well. In the Drupal space, I even said Drupal a couple times in this presentation. There's things in the contrib space that find their way into Drupal core, like JSON API, or things from the panels ecosystem that influence Layout Builder. And I think it's pretty foundational with modern JavaScript. If you're writing modern JavaScript, you're probably using some sort of transpiler like Babel at this point. And what Babel does is it takes all of your fancy cutting-edge JavaScript and compiles it in a way that a wider set of browsers can actually use. But over time, those things that you would have to transpile are finding their way into the language, and ES6 and ESNext and ES 2027 and all that good stuff. So that again kind of influences what's happening in the language. So I wonder if the same thing could happen with scope in CSS. There does seem to be an interest in having component scope. There's a bunch of ways, some of them pretty weird, to do it. So could that happen? Interestingly enough, the HTML scoped attribute was actually in the spec and was incorporated in Firefox for a specific set of tiny little green there, but was abandoned, which is interesting. And it basically is, or I believe this is what inspired the approach in Vue that we saw, where you can actually just add scoped to your style element, basically the same exact thing, but implemented in Vue. So I wonder if maybe the interest that we've seen in the CSS and JS approaches can revive this or something like it. Who knows? Another possible alternative is that web components or the shadow DOM is what's going to bring us this more generally. So for the shadow DOM, things are scoped locally by default. A lot of the same kind of concepts here. It's possible to also use global styles or override them in your component. But there's still a decent amount of JavaScript that you need here to create your web component. So, I wonder if there's a more CSS-y way to do it. Unknown. But, I'm trying to predict the future here. Who knows? Maybe there will never be a traditional way to do this. But, again, I think that there is so much interest in this, so many different approaches that we may find years from now a way that this is just part of the language. And I was wondering if maybe I couldn't find a good enough Baby Yoda GIF to be like really, really modern with this, but had to go with traditional Yoda. Also, one thing to plug, a counterpoint. So Aubrey later today has a talk putting the C back in CSS, which I saw at NetCamp. Is a great talk. You should go for that reason alone. But I also think it's really cool that today, within one day, we have basically like multiple camera angles on the same topic. There'll be some interesting counterpoints and like a different view to some of the stuff that I talked about today. So I think that's pretty rad. And this time, for real, that is the end of the talk. Thank you very much to all of you, and also the meme, why don't we have both girls? Very, very supportive today. Thanks. And I think we do have a little bit of time for questions, if anybody has them. Yes?
So currently I'm in the beginning stages of moving the website from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and in my mind at least I've decided that I'm going to use them for styling everything. It just seems it fits easier with the way I think, and in my head feels like it'll fit easier with Drupal 8. But I know that, like, currently I use utility classes as well, and Do you think it's a good idea to combine that? So combine them naming convention with also some utility classes for like padding or colors or whatever?
Yep.
Not a bad idea.
So the question was, going from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, he's thinking about using BEM and wondering if that can be combined with utility classes. And yes, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. Again, it's kind of that same trade-off that we talked about through a lot of this, in that your BEM classes are going to be more component-focused, but I think having utility classes will definitely help and can be used. But you do run into that situation where it does open the door to some of the the utility classes and changes there potentially affecting other things. But yeah, I think that's really common. Even a lot of the projects that I've used BEM on, there still are utility classes. Also, variables that are defined for things like spacing as well. So even within your BEM classes, you can use some of those like tokens that you use in your utility classes as well. Or you can also use you can like extend with Sass in your BEM classes as well. So, but yeah, that's totally common. Any other questions?
And the JavaScript isn't loading CSS, does that meaningfully change the time it takes?
Yeah. So the question was, if when the JavaScript runtime is handling the CSS, does that impact the time and performance and potentially rendering? Yes, it does. So that's definitely another potential trade-off. In a lot of cases where you're using that CSS and JavaScript approach, you're already kind of all in on JavaScript anyway. So it's probably not your first problem, but it's on the list. Yeah. Yes.
Are you building these components or just using existing components instead?
Both. The question was if you're building these components or using existing components. When you're using other components, though, in a lot of cases, you're kind of stuck with the choices that they have made. There are some ways that you can override them, but you kind of, in a lot of cases, get what you get. Yes?
Is there much out there for like the hybrid of sort of the global CSS, but then using the component JavaScript? I'm just so used to the global, this is where you go for this area, or Sass like pulling things in. So when we're going to these JavaScript components, how often are you including something else, you're pulling something other than just that one component CSS?
Yeah, so the question was if there are like hybrid approaches for the CSS and JavaScript thing, and yeah, so I probably could have hit that even a little bit harder, but I think there's a misconception with a lot of the CSS in JavaScript solutions that they are always like only component scoped, and that's what a lot of them do by default, and it's probably the reason that a lot of people use them. But almost all of them have some way to use traditional global CSS as well. So either alongside it, or even in the JavaScript-based solution, have a way to define that something should be global. So I'd say most of them allow you to do that.
Are people using it like the local component is an override to a global more often?
That's a little hard to answer. I think that I have the
HTML elements, and then I only override them with component.
I have the perception that a lot of really JavaScript-focused developers use these mostly exclusively with component scope, right? But I think that there's a big advantage to still having your global rules. I can't imagine not having like global typography set, right? If you're not doing that, you're really missing out. So yeah, a little hard to answer that.
Okay.
Cool. Any other questions? We might be up on time for real, but cool. Thanks, everybody.